Section 9 of the Watergate Report, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Giordano. Chapter 8. The Hughes Rebozo Investigation and Related Matters. Part 2. 4. Rebozo's 1969 Responsibilities. A. Introduction. There is evidence before the committee indicating that in 1969, Charles Beebe Rebozo exercised a number of responsibilities on behalf of the White House and President Nixon. These simultaneous assignments included the following: 1. Fundraising for the use of the administration. 2. The dispersal of funds for various administration-connected projects. 3. Acting as agent for President Nixon in the purchase, improvement, and maintenance of his home in Key Biscayne, Florida. 4. Fundraising for the President's re-election campaign. B. Fundraising. On February 17, 1969, H.R. Haldeman wrote a confidential memorandum to John Ehrlichman, which stated in part, Beebe Rebozo has been asked by the President to contact J. Paul Getty in London regarding major contributions. Beebe would like advice from you or someone as to how this can legally and technically be handled. The funds should go to some operating entity other than the National Committee so that we can retain full control of their use. Beebe would appreciate your calling him with this advice as soon as possible, since the President has asked him to move quickly. Signed, H. H.R. Haldeman stated through his attorney that he recalled that Rebozo attempted to obtain a contribution from J. Paul Getty. Edward L. Morgan said in an interview that shortly after his appointment to the White House staff in early 1969, he was called by John Ehrlichman. Morgan said that Ehrlichman requested his advice on whether a contributor like J. Paul Getty could give $50,000 to the administration to be used for social events at the White House until July 1969, when a new budget appropriation would be available for such purposes. Morgan stated that he called Chuck Stewart, a friend of his in the White House, who also worked for Ehrlichman, to discuss the matter, and that they agreed that using private contributions to fund White House social functions was inappropriate. Morgan also said that he advised Ehrlichman that he and Stewart agreed that private contributions for such social functions were inappropriate. Rebozo testified that Herb Kalmbach asked him to make an appointment for Kalmbach with J. Paul Getty for the purpose of obtaining a contribution for the 1972 election. Rebozo testified that he had not been asked by anyone else to speak to Getty himself, nor had he been requested by anyone else to obtain money from Mr. Getty. Herbert Kalmbach testified that Rebozo had asked Kalmbach to solicit funds from Mr. Getty for the 1970 senatorial campaign program. Kalmbach also testified that Rebozo, quote, set it up for him to see Mr. Getty in Europe, end quote. General Alexander Haig testified that President Nixon had advised him that Mr. Rebozo had received campaign contributions frequently, and that he normally or generally passed them on to the campaign. Haig further testified that he assumed that the time period discussed by the President included 1969 through 1971. In addition to this evidence concerning the contact with J. Paul Getty in early 1969, Rebozo was also having discussions at about the same time with Richard Danner about the possibility of a cash contribution from Howard Hughes. These discussions are covered more fully in a subsequent section of this report. C. Dispersal of funds. There is evidence indicating that Rebozo maintained a fund in Florida to pay for administration-connected costs. In a letter of April 28, 1969, from Rebozo to Kalmbach, Rebozo wrote in part, "Over the weekend I spoke with John Ehrlichman and explained to him that it had been decided that the larger balance which I mentioned to you will be kept here in order to take care of frequent administration-connected costs which arise from time to time." There is evidence indicating that the fund which Rebozo maintained in Florida consisted of campaign funds. Rebozo testified that he retained about $6,000 from the 1968 campaign because the campaign owed him that amount for expenses that he had covered during the campaign. On April 15, 1969, Rebozo set up the Wakefield special account with a deposit of $6,000 from the Florida Nixon for President Committee. Thomas H. Wakefield testified that he did not know that this account was opened until later, when Rebozo advised him that he had established the account and that both individuals were signatories. On April 15, 1969, Jack Caulfield wrote to Herbert Kalmbach a letter which said in part, "Listed below is a list of expenses incurred by myself and another individual who shall remain nameless with respect to matters of interest to J.D.E." Caulfield's bill totaled $320, and he concluded, "I would appreciate a check in the amount indicated above to be mailed to my residence, 13 Carlton Road, Orangeburg, New York." On April 17, 1969, Kalmbach wrote a letter to John Ehrlichman, which said in part, "Confirming our conversation of a few minutes ago, I'm in the process of setting up one trustee for client's account at the Security Pacific National Bank's Newport Beach office home here in the Newport Center. The initial deposit will be in the amount of $216.18, which was received from Beebe this date. I will write checks to Jack Caulfield and whomever else you may authorize to receive payments at such time as I receive the additional funds." Rebozo also sent Kalmbach an additional check for $200 on April 28, 1969, and a check from the Wakefield special account to Kalmbach for $1,000 on July 17, 1969. These funds were subsequently used by Herbert Kalmbach to pay the expenses and salary of Anthony T. Ulasewicz. There is conflicting testimony concerning whether or not Rebozo was aware of the purpose of the funds he forwarded in 1969. Rebozo testified that he had advised Kalmbach after the 1968 election that he had leftover funds available, and that subsequently Kalmbach requested some of the funds to be sent to him. Rebozo testified that Kalmbach did not indicate, nor did Rebozo ask, what the purpose of the funds was. Kalmbach said he was authorized by John Ehrlichman to contact Rebozo about obtaining leftover campaign funds to pay for Caulfield's expense statement submitted to Kalmbach. Kalmbach testified that he then contacted Rebozo to obtain funds to pay for the expenses of Caulfield and Ulasewicz. Kalmbach testified that he had discussed the nature of the activities of Caulfield and Ulasewicz with Rebozo, and that Rebozo specifically knew that the money was for Caulfield and Ulasewicz. Kalmbach's notes also indicate that he called Rebozo during the week of July 14, 1969, and that they had discussed the payment of Ulasewicz as well as the payment of his expenses. However, Rebozo testified that he was not aware of the purpose of the funds that he forwarded to Kalmbach. Rebozo also used funds to pay for personal expenses for President Nixon from 1969 through 1973. These expense items are more fully explained later in this report. Finally, Larry Higby, formerly H.R. Haldeman's administrative assistant, testified that on or about April 30, 1973, at about the time of Haldeman's resignation. Mr. Haldeman told me that during one of the discussions he had had with the President at the time of, or immediately after his resignation, the President indicated that Mr. Rebozo did have some funds that could be made available to Mr. Haldeman, and as I understand it, also to Mr. Ehrlichman, for the purpose of assisting in a legal defense. Higbee also testified that Haldeman advised him that Rebozo had somewhere, "in the neighborhood of $400,000 available to assist on legal fees." Higbee testified that he had confirmed the substance of his testimony 2 weeks earlier in a telephone conversation with Haldeman. D. Acting Agent for President Nixon at Key Biscayne. On the day following President Nixon's inauguration in 1969, Thomas H. Wakefield testified that he met with the President and Bebe Rebozo at a White House staff reception. Wakefield testified that at this meeting with President Nixon and Rebozo, Wakefield was given instructions concerning matters which resulted in expenditures incurred on behalf of President Nixon. Footnote: Hearings 11333-34. Wakefield refused to answer a number of questions about his conversation with President Nixon and Charles G. Rebozo because of the attorney-client privilege Wakefield asserted with respect to both individuals. End footnote. Wakefield refused to discuss these instructions, claiming they were protected by the attorney-client privilege. Wakefield also testified that this meeting with President Nixon and Rebozo was the first occasion when Wakefield was informed by the President that henceforth Rebozo would act as the President's agent for matters that Wakefield refused to describe. Wakefield also testified that he attended a second meeting at the White House with John Ehrlichman and Bebe Rebozo either later the same day or the following day after Wakefield's meeting with President Nixon. Wakefield again refused to disclose the substance of this conversation on the grounds of attorney-client privilege and because, "Mr. Rebozo was designated an agent in the beginning of the conversation by Mr. Ehrlichman." Wakefield stated that some action was taken as a result of his meeting with Ehrlichman and Rebozo, but Wakefield declined to describe what occurred because of his attorney-client relationship with the President. As will be described more fully in a section below, certain $100 bills were deposited among trust accounts held by Thomas H. Wakefield and were applied for expenditures on behalf of the President's Key Biscayne homes at the instructions of Bebe Rebozo. In addition, Richard Danner's diary entry of November 21, 1968, reflects, "LD from CGR Miami RE House Project." Danner testified that this notation reflected a telephone call with Rebozo, but that Danner had, "no recollection whatsoever of what House Project had to do with that conversation." Danner did recall his friend, former Senator George Smathers, telling him that Smathers was going to sell his house to President Nixon following the 1968 election, but Danner had no recollection of discussing this sale with Bebe Rebozo. Therefore, at the time in early 1969, when Rebozo and Danner again began to discuss a contribution from Howard Hughes, there is evidence indicating Rebozo was already raising funds at the direction of the President. Rebozo was disbursing money from the campaign funds for various administration projects, and Rebozo was acting as agent for President Nixon with respect to the purchase and maintenance of his Key Biscayne homes. 5. Delivery and retention of the contributions. Introduction and summary of facts. Contributions that were finally delivered to Rebozo were the culmination of the attempted deliveries during 1968 described earlier. A contribution was discussed during the 1968 election and continued to be an item of discussion thereafter among various parties, including Hughes, Mayhew, Danner, and Rebozo. The discussions were intense in early December 1968 and continued into the spring and summer of 1969, when Rebozo chided Danner about Hughes' generous support of Democrats and less sizable support of President Nixon, and Maheu authorized a contribution to Rebozo. The testimony on the deliveries of the money is voluminous and often contradictory, and Danner, Maheu, and Rebozo maintain few written records of the transaction. Rebozo testified that the money he received from Danner remained unused in a safe deposit box from its delivery to him in 2 installments, until he returned it to agents of Hughes in June 1973. That testimony has been challenged by other testimony and evidence before the Select Committee. The available testimony and evidence point to the following facts. 1. The money for one of the deliveries to Rebozo was put together in early December 1968. There is considerable testimony from various principals indicating that the first delivery consisted of money made available in December 1968 and that it was maintained whole until the ultimate delivery. In early December 1968, Robert Maheu and others acting on behalf of Howard Hughes were deeply involved in attempts to make a Hughes to Nixon contribution. Robert Maheu received $100,000 in cash in early December, $50,000 of which he tried to deliver to President-elect Nixon or one of his aides at Palm Springs, pursuant to negotiations commenced earlier in the year by Rebozo and Danner. Danner was in Las Vegas during this December 1968 period talking about joining the Hughes organization and, according to one of Danner's recollections, discussing political contributions with Maheu. 50 consecutively numbered $100 bills among those Rebozo identified as the first delivery were, according to Federal Reserve Board records and other documentary evidence, delivered to the Las Vegas bank used by Hughes casinos during this early December 1968 period. 2. The first delivery took place in 1969. In their initial interviews and testimony, the principals involved in the deliveries agreed that 1969 was the year of the first delivery. Maheu has continued to subscribe to that statement. Danner changed his testimony after consultation with Rebozo, and Rebozo changed from 1969 in his first interview with the IRS to 1970 in subsequent testimony as the year of the first delivery. 3. The first delivery to Rebozo occurred September 11 or 12, 1969 in Key Biscayne, Florida. When Danner joined the Hughes organization in February 1969, there was an ongoing concern that the money be delivered soon. According to Danner, in the spring of 1969, he and Maheu noted that the 1968 money was still intact and available for Rebozo, and Danner told Rebozo that it was available. Not long before September 11th and 12th, Maheu authorized a delivery to Rebozo. Robert Maheu has stated the first delivery took place in 1969. Danner's first statement regarding this contribution substantially comports with Maheu's recollection of the first delivery. Danner's testimony until changed in July 1973, after consultation with Rebozo, was that the first delivery was in September 1969. 4. There is considerable evidence suggesting that the second delivery took place on July 3, 1970, or August 1970, and there is some evidence of a delivery on October 28 or 30, 1970. July 3, 1970. According to Rebozo and Danner, this was the date of a delivery at San Clemente. Both men have always contended that one of the two deliveries was at San Clemente, and Danner testified that this is the only time he was there. Only Rebozo testified firmly that this was the first delivery. Maheu stated that both deliveries were at Key Biscayne. August 19 and 20, 1970. If the first delivery were on July 3rd, the second delivery would have been either August 19th or 20th, or October 28th or 30th. Danner and Mayhew discounted the October date as too close to the 1970 election for the money to have been used for congressional campaigns. Rebozo testified that the second delivery was in Key Biscayne, following the July 3, 1970 delivery within a, quote, matter of weeks. It could have been 3 months. I don't know. I think I saw somewhere Danner had indicated it was in August, and that would be correct. End quote. October 28 to 30, 1970. The strongest evidence supporting this late 1970 date is the statement of Thomas Bell, a Hughes lawyer, that he gave $50,000 to Danner on October 26th. Danner testified that he did not receive money from Bell, however, and Danner and Robert Mayhew doubted a delivery so close to the 1970 congressional election. 5. There is evidence suggesting that there may have been more than 2 deliveries from Danner to Rebozo. The only way much of the conflicting testimony can be reconciled is to conclude there were more than 2 deliveries of funds. There are 4 likely delivery dates: September 11 through 12, 1969, July 3, 1970, August 19 and 20, 1970, and October 28 through 30, 1970. 4 packets of money have been identified as possible sources of the deliveries. Early December 1968, Sands Casino. December 5, 1968, Nadine Henley. July 11, 1969, Nadine Henley. And October 26, 1970, Thomas Bell, Silver Slipper. 6. Documentary evidence from the Federal Reserve raises the question whether Rebozo maintained the 2 deliveries intact. See below. The following summary paragraphs should help the reader understand the detailed information that follows. Section A sets forth the testimony and statements of the principals. There are numerous contradictions among the principals, and most of them have contradicted themselves on key points. Section B is an analysis of the possible sources of the contributions to Rebozo, determining when and where the money for the 2 deliveries were put together is directly related to an examination of Rebozo's testimony that the money he received from Hughes was the same money he returned to Hughes in June 1973. The Hughes people involved in assembling the money for delivery to Rebozo, notably Robert Mayhew, have stated that the money for each delivery remained intact from the time it was assembled until the dates of delivery to Rebozo by Richard Danner, Hughes' agent. The Select Committee attempted to determine the accuracy of that assertion, and have found no contradictory evidence or testimony. In contrast, Rebozo's testimony that he did not disturb or use the money has been challenged by testimony and evidence received by the Select Committee. The available evidence suggests that $50,000 for one of the deliveries was obtained in early 1968, and the money returned and identified as the Hughes contribution. Footnote: the serial numbers which the Select Committee and the Federal Reserve System have been tracing are those of the 1001 Federal Reserve notes Rebozo returned. While the contribution is generally referred to as a $100,000 contribution, Rebozo returned $100,100. How and when the extra note got into the money is an unresolved question. The committee has no evidence that a list of serial numbers were prepared when the money was put together or when it was delivered. End of footnote. Are numerous $100 bills in the package identified as the first delivery and in the package identified as the second delivery that were not available for commercial circulation until after early December 1968. Therefore, either the money was not kept intact from time of origin in December 1968 until its delivery to Rebozo, or it was not kept intact by Rebozo between its receipt and its return. Section C analyzes the possible delivery dates and reaches the conclusions summarized above. Section D analyzes the testimony and evidence relating to the storage of the used contributions by Rebozo. Section E compares the testimony and evidence relating to possible combinations of sources and delivery dates with the available Federal Reserve records. The comparison raises a question whether the money Rebozo returned was the same money he received. For example, if the first delivery was on July 3, 1970, in San Clemente, and the second on August 19 or 20, 1970, in Key Biscayne, a probable combination, according to testimony by Danner and Rebozo, there are 35 bills in the money returned and identified as the second delivery that were not available for commercial circulation until after August 20th, 1970. Those 35 bills, therefore, could not have been delivered to Rebozo on August 19th or 20th, but instead would have been inserted into the package identified as the second delivery at some later date before Rebozo returned the money. The latest date of commercial distribution is October 1st, 1970, when a 1969 series $100 bill, serial number GO2 134916A, was released to the Lakeview Trust and Savings Bank of Chicago by the Chicago Federal Reserve Bank. The 35 bills are as follows. Federal Reserve notes identified as part of second delivery to Rebozo, not available for commercial distribution until after August 19 through 20, 1970. Footnote: for some of the notes listed below, records exist showing dates of distribution to commercial banks. For other bills, however, records exist only through the date of release to a Federal Reserve Bank's cash department. The dates of commercial release for those notes would be on or after the dates of release to cash departments. End of footnote. Chart. Heading: Series, Serial, Date released to Cash Department, Federal Reserve Bank, Date released to Commercial Bank. Series 1969, GO2 134916A. September 8, 1970, Chicago. October 1, 1970, Lakeview Trust, Chicago. 1969, LO2 012307A. September 3, 1970, Los Angeles. September 23, 1970, New National Bank, Las Vegas, 4th and Bridge. 1969, B00745-268A. September 21, 1970, New York. 1969, LO2 044519A. September 3, 1970, Los Angeles. September 16, 1970, New National Bank, Las Vegas, 4th and Bridge. 1969, LO3 169610A. September 11, 1970, Los Angeles. September 14, 1970, New National Bank, Las Vegas, 4th and Bridge. 1969, LO3 201320A. 1969, LO3 169914A. 1969, LO3 169915A. 1969, LO3 170246A. 1969, LO3 170247A. 1969, LO3 171517A. 1969, LO3 171653A. 1969, LO3 201337A. 1969, LO3 202841A. 1963A, H00933 849A. September 8, 1970, St. Louis. 1963A. LO3 967973A. September 3, 1970, Los Angeles. 1963A. LO3 967972A. 1969. LO1 996101A. 1969. LO1 997818A. 1969. LO1 997820A. 1969. LO1 998739A. 1969. LO2 006342A. 1969. LO2 011839A. 1969. LO2 036812A. 1969. LO2 039302A. 1969. LO2 039303A. 1969. LO2 047193A. 1969. LO1 998424A. 1969. K00853-653A. August 5th, 1970, Dallas. September 2nd, 1970, Northwest National Bank, Dallas. 1963A. LO3 778452A. June 9th, 1970, Los Angeles. September 2nd, 1970, Valley National Bank, Las Vegas. 1963A. LO3 778219A. 1969. LO1 455291A. August 27, 1970, Los Angeles. 1969. LO1 447735A. End of chart. It is possible that the second delivery was not made until late October 1970, as discussed in section VC, in which case the Federal Reserve evidence does not contradict Rebozo's testimony. The October date, however, is less probable than several other dates as explained in section VC. End of section 9. Recording by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida. Section 10 of The Watergate Report, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Giordano. Final report of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, Volume 3. The Hughes Rebozo Investigation and Related Matters, Part 3. A. Testimony and Statements of the Principals. The testimony and statements by the key participants concerning the deliveries of the Hughes $100,000 do not conform in many key respects. Most of the people involved have changed their testimony and statements as the investigation progressed. The only consistent assertion of all principals has been that there were only 2 deliveries. When initially questioned about the deliveries, the various parties, Robert Maheu, Peter Maheu, Danner, and Rebozo, placed the date of the first delivery within about 1 year of the November 1968 election. Footnote: Citations for the statements made by the various parties are in the lengthier discussions below. End of footnote. As the investigation intensified, from about the time Rebozo returned the money in June 1973, the parties began recalling later delivery dates. Other differences in testimony have occurred including significant changes regarding locations of deliveries and number of people present. For example, Robert Maheu has stated that he was present at a delivery in Key Biscayne. Danner initially so testified, but later, after talking with Rebozo, changed his testimony to agree with Rebozo's testimony that Maheu was not present. Testimony about the Hughes-Rebozo contribution has been extensive and varied. In addition to the staff interviews and sworn testimony in sessions before the Select Committee, testimony concerning the contribution can be found in the Maheu v. Hughes Tool Company civil litigation. Footnote: Robert A. Maheu v. Hughes Tool Company, Civil number 72-305, HP, U.S. District Court for the Central District of California. End of footnote. The interviews and depositions relating to the Securities and Exchange Commission's investigation of the acquisition of Air West by Hughes. Footnote: Securities and Exchange Commission, case number H0596. Information from the Commission was furnished to the Select Committee pursuant to a letter of disclosure. William Turner, a lawyer with the SEC, was particularly helpful. End of footnote. And the interviews and affidavits furnished to the Select Committee by the Internal Revenue Service pursuant to a Senate resolution. Footnote: See Senate Resolution 288, 93rd Congress, 2nd Session. End of footnote. The following summary is not exhaustive and must be read in conjunction with the later sections of the report analyzing the contribution. 1. Richard Danner. In February 1969, Richard Danner commenced his employment with Hughes Tool Company as general manager of the Frontier Hotel. His responsibilities also called for him to serve as liaison for the Hughes entities in the Nixon administration. According to Robert Maheu, Hughes was especially pleased that Danner joined the Hughes operation, inasmuch as the 1968 campaign contribution still remained undelivered, and Danner, with his connections with Rebozo, could readily remedy this problem. While Danner's recollection has been unclear about the dates of deliveries, who was present, and who provided the money to him, he testified with certainty about the circumstances leading up to the decision to make the $100,000 in cash available to Rebozo. Danner testified that, in the spring of 1969, he had frequent contacts with Rebozo, during which Rebozo was needling him about Hughes' apparent favoritism toward the Democrats by making a large contribution available to then Vice President Humphrey in 1968, by having Larry O'Brien on retainer, and by employing Senator Humphrey's son. Danner testified that he brought Rebozo's comments to Maheu's attention, and that shortly thereafter, Peter Maheu, Robert's son, showed Danner canceled checks reflecting payments to various Nixon-Agnew committees during the 1968 campaign. Danner testified that he related that information to Rebozo, and, quote, he, Rebozo, still felt that was not comparable to what they had done for Humphrey, end quote. Danner then told Rebozo that the $50,000 undelivered at Palm Springs was still intact and available. According to Danner's testimony, Rebozo declined the offer. The contribution came up a short time later, in May or June 1969, when Danner testified that Rebozo raised the question of whether Mr. Hughes would contribute to funds to begin taking polls on candidates for the 1970 congressional elections. The contribution came up a short time later, in May or June 1969, when Danner testified that Rebozo raised the, quote, question of whether Mr. Hughes would contribute to funds to begin taking polls on candidates for the 1970 congressional elections, end quote. According to Danner, he then discussed this matter with Maheu, who said that the undelivered $50,000 was available, and that an additional $50,000 could be committed. Danner's only other consistent testimony has been that there were only two deliveries, one at San Clemente and one at Key Biscayne. Danner testified that Robert Maheu told him the money for the first delivery was in the safe deposit box at the Frontier Hotel. It was either brought to Danner by Peter or Robert Maheu, or Danner picked it up himself from the safe deposit box. He did not count the bills upon receipt, but did note they were bundled in packages of $5,000 each. In a transcribed question and answer session with the IRS on May 15, 1972, the first time he was questioned on the $100,000, Danner stated that the first delivery took place at Key Biscayne in the late summer of 1969, where Robert Maheu handed the package to Rebozo, and that the second delivery was at San Clemente at an unspecified later date. According to a contemporaneous memorandum, he told an IRS agent on November 29, 1972, in a telephone conversation, that the first delivery in Key Biscayne was in September 1969, and the second delivery in San Clemente on July 3, 1970. In a July 5, 1973 affidavit filed with the IRS as a correction to his May 15, 1972 questioning, Danner changed his prior statement. He said he was certain that the first contribution, not the second, took place on July 3, 1973, at San Clemente, with only Rebozo and Danner present, and that the second contribution was made in Key Biscayne on August 19-20, 1970, again with only Rebozo and Danner present. He stated to the Select Committee that he had been to the Western White House at San Clemente only once, which his travel records show to be on July 3, 1970. Danner testified that he met with the President and Rose Woods after the delivery to Rebozo at San Clemente. His discussion with the President, Danner testified, focused on, quote, the problems at the White House getting entertainment suitable for young audiences and so on, end quote, and that there was no mention of the contribution. In his discussion with Rosemary Woods, Danner testified that there was no talk about the purpose of Danner's visit. Woods had no recollection of meeting Danner in July 1970, and said, in a staff interview, that, quote, I would not know Danner if he walked in, end quote. Danner testified that he was unable to explain why the first delivery would not have been made until the summer of 1970, rather than in the fall of 1969, shortly after the spring 1969 Rebozo-Danner discussions of a possible contribution and Maheu's authorization of the delivery. 2. Robert A. Maheu. In his statements and testimony about the two $50,000 contributions, Robert Maheu has provided conflicting information about sources of the money and delivery dates. First, $50,000. When Danner joined the Hughes organization, there were ongoing discussions between Hughes and Maheu about the uncompleted 1968 contribution. Maheu suggested Danner as a courier for the funds, and Hughes agreed. Maheu has provided conflicting statements on the origin of the money. In September 1971, Maheu told the IRS that the first $50,000 came from the cashier's cage at the Sands Hotel in early December 1968. In a 1973 IRS interview, Maheu said the money consisted of the same bills he received from Nadine Henley on December 5 and 6, 1968, and turned over to Peter Maheu upon his return from the Palm Springs Governor's Conference. In a later interview with Select Committee staff, he said that he received the money for the first delivery from Henley on July 11, 1969. As to the first delivery, in a 1973 civil deposition, Maheu testified that, quote, Mr. Danner made the first delivery, which would have been sometime in, to the best of my recollection, sometime in 1969, end quote. Maheu told Select Committee investigators that the delivery was made shortly after Danner joined the Hughes Corporation, which was in February 1969. Later in the same interview, Mayhew stated that the first delivery must have been sometime after July 11, 1969, the date on which Henley sent him $50,000. Similarly, Mayhew has expressed uncertainty about the mechanics of the first transaction, recalling only that it was his son Peter who transmitted the money to Danner sometime after the early December 1968 Palm Springs Governors Conference. Mayhew testified in a civil deposition that Key Biscayne was the place of the first delivery, recalling that Danner and he had flown together on the de Havilland to Miami to make the first delivery. According to Mayhew, the purpose of the first delivery was to fulfill the pledge that had been made to the Nixon campaign in 1968. He stated that both he and Hughes were concerned that they did not appear to be reneging on their commitments. Second $50,000. Mayhew has given different dates and different reasons for this delivery. He is, however, certain that he was present when an envelope filled with cash was passed to Rebozo in Key Biscayne. Mayhew first told the committee staff he was contacted by Bob Hope concerning a possible contribution of $50,000 to $100,000 to the Eisenhower Hospital. Mayhew discussed it with Hughes, and Hughes suggested that Mayhew contribute $10,000 to the hospital, and at the same time pledged to the Nixon administration that Hughes would make additional contributions to the congressional races. Hughes felt that through that arrangement he could get more mileage out of the administration. In his July 4, 1973 deposition, where he first publicly discussed Hughes's political contributions, Mayhew noted that the decision to make the contribution was based on conversations with Danner, who told Mayhew of the political necessity of the contribution rather than on Hughes' instructions relative to Mayhew's conversation with Bob Hope. In a civil deposition, Mayhew testified that the money was transmitted to Danner by Thomas Bell, a Hughes lawyer in Las Vegas in early 1970. Later, in a Select Committee staff interview, he said Bell delivered it to Danner in the summer of 1970. In his second staff interview, he said that he had testified under oath to a federal grand jury investigating Hughes's acquisition of Air West, that the delivery to Rebozo was made by Danner and him on February 3 through 5, 1970, in Key Biscayne. Finally, in that same interview, he stated that Thomas Bell's testimony that the money was taken from the Silver Slipper on October 26, 1970, plus the trip he and Danner took to Florida about that time, led him to believe that the money could have been delivered in late October 1970. The second delivery, according to Mayhew, occurred at Rebozo's home in Key Biscayne. Mayhew saw the envelope pass from Danner to Rebozo, who opened it but did not count the money. Rebozo then took the envelope, went into another room, and returned in a short time without the envelope. The only conversation was something by Danner to the effect of, quote, "Here's the second 50, end quote. No one else was present, and the three immediately left in Rebozo's car to go out for dinner. 3. Peter R. Mayhew. Peter Mayhew has stated that he transmitted one $50,000 packet to Richard Danner. Robert Mayhew, Peter's father, has testified he instructed him to do so. Footnote: Robert A. Mayhew, Civil Deposition, July 4, 1973, page 1096. As noted in the sections detailing Robert Mayhew's testimony, there is conflict concerning when Peter Mayhew received this money from his father. End of footnote. And Richard Danner has testified that he possibly received money from Peter Mayhew. Footnote: Richard Danner, Civil Deposition, September 4, 1973, page 48. Danner's recollection is not clear on the event. End of footnote. Peter Mayhew recalled that he received the money at his father's house in 1969 from his father, who asked Peter to take it because Robert Mayhew's safe was not working at the time. Peter Mayhew stated that the money was wrapped in packets of $50 bills, with a standard bank wrapper around each packet, and that the bills were not new. Peter Mayhew only recalled his father saying, quote, something to the effect that the money was for political contributions and to place it in my safe and disperse it at his direction. End quote. Peter Mayhew stated that the source of the money was a Silver Slipper casino in Las Vegas, which Hughes owned in his own name and used for political contributions. Peter Mayhew took the money home, removed it from the envelope, and put it in his safe. He kept the money for a short period of time, perhaps 3 weeks, at which time his father instructed him to deliver it to Danner, explaining, as Peter remembered it, that, quote, Danner was bringing the money to Mr. Rebozo. Mr. Rebozo was going to give the money to Mr. Nixon. End quote. Peter then took the money to Danner at the Frontier Hotel. According to Peter, his meeting with Danner was, quote, extremely short, end quote, and he just, quote, dropped off the money, end quote. He may have told Danner to, quote, have a good trip, end quote. Peter Mayhew was confident that Danner went to Florida to deliver the money and was sure that his father did not accompany Danner on that trip. Finally, Peter Mayhew, in his staff interview, stated that someone in his father's office gave him a typed sheet of paper to be signed by Richard Nixon, acknowledging Nixon's receipt of $100,000 from Hughes. Danner told Peter Mayhew that Nixon will, quote, never sign it, end quote, and Mayhew has been unable to find the document. 4. Thomas G. Bell. According to Robert Mayhew, the second $50,000 contribution was transmitted to Richard Danner by Thomas Bell, a Hughes attorney in Las Vegas. In a Select Committee staff interview, Bell stated that he was involved in only one delivery of money to Richard Danner, $50,000 delivered at the direction of Robert Mayhew in October of 1970. Bell reasoned that this time was a delivery date by examining the Silver Slipper disbursement forms and noting that he delivered the money in one lump sum just prior to the congressional election of 1970. Since he had never had as much as $50,000 in a lump sum other than on October 26, 1970, when he withdrew $115,000 from the Silver Slipper. He stated that this withdrawal was the source of the money for Danner. On the date of withdrawal, he received a call from Robert Mayhew, who, with a great sense of urgency, said that Hughes wanted the money delivered to Danner. Bell went to the Silver Slipper, got the money, and immediately delivered it to Danner in Danner's office at the Frontier Hotel. Bell recalled no conversation with Danner. Bell stated that the same day, or early on the next day, he made a local call to Mayhew to announce that the money had been delivered. Bell said there were 10 packages of $100 bills, totaling $50,000, and that most of the bills were fairly new and crisp. He is not certain whether the money was wrapped at a Las Vegas bank or at the Silver Slipper, but he was certain that the wrappers were initialed and dated. 5. Charles G. Rebozo. Charles Rebozo testified that he had no official fundraising responsibilities with regard to the 1972 presidential campaign when he began to discuss the Hughes contribution with Richard Danner in 1969, but that nonetheless, Rebozo stated to the committee that the $100,000 contribution from Hughes was received on behalf of the 1972 Nixon re-election campaign. Footnote: 21 Hearings, 9955. In addition to Rebozo's receipt of $100,000, which he claims was for the 1972 Nixon campaign, records indicate that Hughes contributed $150,000 to the 1972 Nixon campaign, $50,000 of which appeared on the pre-April 7, 1972 list of contributors kept by Rosemary Woods. The remainder was contributed after April 7 and duly recorded. End of footnote. Rebozo's first discussion of the two contributions with a governmental agency took place May 10, 1973, when, according to an IRS memorandum of the interview, he stated that he received the money on 2 separate occasions, each in the amount of $50,000, that he could not recall whether he received the first package in Key Biscayne or California, but that he had received one package in each location. The California location was San Clemente. We attempted to zero in on the dates that he received the money. To his best recollection, it was late 1968 or early 1969, and that there were 2 or 3 months between each delivery. Mr. Rebozo said he had been approached by Danner in the fall of 1968, before the election, about a political contribution to Nixon. Rebozo had refused it because he did not think it would be proper. After the election, he was approached again by Danner about the contribution. Rebozo could not remember whether he approached Danner or Danner approached him. As far as Rebozo was concerned, the money was for President Nixon's 1972 campaign. Mr. Rebozo was asked if it could have been for senatorial or congressional campaigns in 1970. Rebozo stated not as far as he was concerned. What was in Danner's or Mayhew's minds, Rebozo did not know. Rebozo testified before the Select Committee that, after the 1968 election, Danner occasionally visited Rebozo in Florida and brought up the subject of a Hughes contribution to President Nixon. During these conversations, Rebozo testified he asked Danner why Hughes hired Larry O'Brien and placed Hubert Humphrey's son on the payroll, if Hughes was generally interested in supporting President Nixon. Rebozo testified that Danner approached him on 4 or 5 occasions in 1969 to offer the contribution, which, Danner later told Rebozo, was the same money earmarked for the 1968 campaign. Rebozo remembered one instance when Danner appeared at Key Biscayne with $50,000, but Rebozo refused to accept it. Rebozo had no recollection of discussing with Danner using the contribution for polling purposes in the 1970 congressional elections. First $50,000 contribution. Rebozo testified that, after a number of conversations with Danner in 1969, Rebozo finally agreed to accept the contribution. His rationale was that Danner then had been working for Hughes a couple of years or so. I had come to know Mayhew, whom I didn't know when he first offered the money. Morgan was seemingly out of the picture, and I began to get a little confidence in the fact that maybe this money could be utilized, and it wouldn't present any embarrassing problems. So it was somewhere after he had been with them for some time they agreed to take it. After agreeing to accept the money, and shortly before the delivery, Rebozo testified that he talked with Danner, who said that he would come to Miami to make the delivery. Rebozo responded that he was, quote, going to be in California next week, and that would save Danner a trip, end quote. Rebozo also recalled Danner saying at about the time of the first delivery that there would be more than $50,000 contributed, but he did not recall whether Danner mentioned a specific amount. Although he initially told the IRS that he was not sure where the first delivery was made, Rebozo later testified that the first contribution took place July 3, 1970, at San Clemente, a conclusion he reached after checking hotel and airline records and talking with Danner. Rebozo testified that he and Danner met alone at San Clemente, and that during this meeting Danner gave him a manila envelope containing $50,000. Rebozo took the envelope and put it in his bag. He has no recollection of what occurred next, but he and Danner may have visited briefly with the president or Rosemary Woods. Second $50,000 delivery. Rebozo testified that the second delivery took place soon after the first, within, quote, a matter of weeks. It could have been 3 months. I really don't know. I think I saw somewhere Danner had indicated it was in August, and that would be correct, end quote. Rebozo could not recall the discussion leading up to this delivery and was, quote, inclined to think that Danner just brought it down to Key Biscayne, end quote. Rebozo testified that he was not certain whether the delivery in Key Biscayne took place at his home or at his bank. Rebozo testified that he is uncertain about any conversation he had with Danner, although Danner may have said, quote, there was another 50, end quote. Rebozo testified that he did not open the envelope. Rebozo testified that Mayhew, quote, was never there when Danner gave me the money on either occasion, end quote. End of section 10. Recording by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida. Section 11 of The Watergate Report, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida. Final Report of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, Volume 3. Chapter 8. The Hughes Rebozo Investigation and Related Matters, Part 4. B. An analysis of possible sources of the contributions. 1. Pre-election 1968. As discussed elsewhere in this report, there was, during the summer and fall of 1968, an unsuccessful attempt to arrange a $50,000 cash contribution from Hughes to then-candidate Nixon. Rebozo, Danner, and Robert Mayhew, key figures in the actual deliveries, were also heavily involved in the 1968 attempt. The committee has no evidence that there was $50,000 in cash put together for a contribution before the election in 1968. 2. The Sands Hotel Cage, early December 1968. In early December 1968, two Hughes employees, Lawrence T. Rillick and John Ianni, withdrew $50,000 in $100 notes from the casino cage at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas. Rillick was then the controller at the Sands, and Ianni was the executive assistant to General Edward Nigro, a top Hughes aide, now deceased, at whose direction the cash was withdrawn. Ianni delivered the cash to Robert Mayhew. Footnote: Rillick telephone interview. Ianni interview note. Supra. Rillick says he was not present at the delivery to Mayhew, but that immediately after making the delivery, Ianni reported his success to Rillick and Nigro. End of footnote. This transaction was unknown to the Select Committee until recently, and the evidence gathered on the withdrawal is consequently incomplete. However, the available evidence suggests that this is a likely source of one of the deliveries. During interviews with staff members, Robert Mayhew did not list this transaction when responding to general questions about political contributions. His explanations of the Sands withdrawal given to the Internal Revenue Service have not been consistent, ranging from no recall to detailed recollection. See above. The details of this withdrawal are particularly important vis-a-vis documentary evidence on the money Rebozo returned, as explained below. The check for $50,000, which was cashed by Rillick, is dated December 4, 1968. The request for the disbursement, signed by General Nigro and Rillick, is dated November 30, 1968. Rillick prepared another request for disbursement for his own record-keeping purpose, not a carbon or photostatic copy of the request. Rillick remembered preparing his disbursement record a day or two after receiving the check, and his disbursement record is dated December 5, 1968. Footnote: a copy of the form is in the files of the IRS. End of footnote. In statements to the IRS, Ianni and Rillick placed the date of the withdrawal as December 5, 1968. However, Rylick has recently indicated that December 5 was only an approximate date of withdrawal. His best recollection was that the check was cashed up to 4 days after December 4, on the date of one of General Negro's staff meetings. The exact date of that meeting has not yet been determined. The check cleared the Bank of Las Vegas on Monday, December 9, so it was cashed sometime between December 4 and December 9. Rylick is sure that it was not cashed on a Saturday or Sunday, December 7 or 8. The significance of these dates is as follows. In the money Rebozo returned and identified as the first delivery, there are 50 consecutively numbered $100 bills that arrived at the Bank of Las Vegas, now the Valley Bank of Nevada, on December 5, 1968, as part of a large money shipment from the Los Angeles Federal Reserve Branch Bank. Footnote: See 26 Hearings Exhibit 24. The bills were delivered by the Federal Reserve to Brinks Incorporated for shipment at 3:50 p.m. on December 4, 1968, according to R. H. Wynn, Sr., Vice President of the Valley Bank. The shipment would have arrived at the Las Vegas Bank on the afternoon of Thursday, December 5. Wynn interview, June 20, 1974. End of footnote. The bills were shipped to the office of the Bank of Las Vegas that was used by the Sands and other used casinos. The money would have been available for bank customers at 9 a.m. on Friday, December 6. According to a Valley Bank official, most of the $100 bills available for customers go out to the customers for weekend use by the end of the day each Friday. The Valley Bank does not keep serial number records on bills it provides to commercial customers, but it is quite possible that the string of 50 bills could have been picked up from the bank by the Sands on December 6. If the December 4 check were not cashed until December 6, these 50 bills could, therefore, have been in the $50,000 packet Mayhew received from Ianni. If the 50 bills were in the packet that was delivered to Robert Mayhew, then their presence in the money Rebozo returned and identified as the first delivery would establish the Sands as a source for that delivery to Rebozo. If the Sands withdrawal was the source, the Federal Reserve evidence shows that not all the money returned and identified as the first delivery could have been the same money assembled at the Sands. There are 88 bills in the money returned and identified as the first delivery that were not available for commercial distribution until after the time of the Sands withdrawal. This circumstantial possibility is particularly interesting in light of the attempted delivery in Palm Springs of cash to the Nixon campaign on December 6 and Danner's visit to Las Vegas on December 5 through 8. In addition, Mayhew's earliest recollection, according to a September 21, 1971 IRS memorandum of a meeting between IRS agents and James Rogers, a tax lawyer for Robert Mayhew, was that the Sands was the source for a delivery to Rebozo. The IRS memorandum stated, Mr. Rogers said Hughes ordered Mayhew to take $50,000 from the cage at the Sands and turn it over to President Nixon. He said that Mayhew probably sent an employee to the cage, who returned and gave the money to Mayhew. Mr. Rogers said that Mayhew was supposed to turn the money, which was in a sealed envelope, over to an aide of President Nixon, but he missed his connections and gave the money to Richard Danner instead, who later turned the money over to an aide of President Nixon's. This recollection of Mayhew's is important in several respects. First, it is the earliest record available on the subject. Thus, it presumably reflected a fresher recollection than, for example, Mayhew's lack of recall about the transaction in an IRS interview some 2 years later. Second, Mayhew's recollection that he sent someone to the cage for the money matches Rylick's observation that Negro's order to withdraw the money, following standard operating procedure, would have been prompted by a Mayhew to Negro order. Similarly, Mayhew's recollection that he received the money comports with what Rylick and Ianni have said. Third, the reference in the memorandum to Mayhew missing connections in the planned delivery to a Nixon aide corresponds to the unsuccessful Palm Springs delivery that occurred about the time of the withdrawal from the Sands. Finally, Mayhew's recollection that he gave the money to Richard Danner, who delivered it to, "an aide of President Nixon," would, if correct, firmly establish this transaction as the source of one of the deliveries to Rebozo. 3. Nadine Henley, December 5, 1968. In addition to the $50,000 from the Sands, Robert Mayhew received 2 deliveries of $25,000 each in $100 notes on December 5 and 6, 1968, from Nadine Henley, a Hughes aide who withdrew it on December 5 from Hughes' personal account in a Hollywood branch of the Bank of America. Henley said that Mayhew requested the $50,000 for a political contribution to President-elect Nixon. Mr. Nixon was in Palm Springs on December 6, 1968. A note written by Henley on December 5, 1968, says that the money she sent to Mayhew on December 5 and 6 was for, "state committees, Nixon's deficit." Mayhew has always acknowledged receiving the above cash. Footnote: IRS interviews from 1971 to 73. Select Committee interviews, January 20-21, 1974. Los Angeles testimony. Mayhew signed receipts for the cash on December 5 and 6, which were labeled as receipts for non-deductible contributions. Henley Exhibit 4, Note 32, Supra. End of footnote. But he has given a number of differing statements of what he did with it. In March 1973, he told the IRS that it was delivered to campaign aides of Hubert Humphrey for use in the 1968 presidential campaign. By early December 1968, of course, the election had already occurred. On January 20 and 21, 1974, Mayhew told Select Committee investigators that this $50,000 was taken to Palm Springs for the unsuccessful delivery to President-elect Nixon, and that it later became the first successful delivery to Rebozo. He questioned that statement on January 21, however, and a few days later stated that, after returning from Palm Springs with this cash obtained from Henley, he used it to reimburse himself for a $50,000 campaign contribution he made directly to Hubert Humphrey earlier in 1968. Footnote: Robert Mayhew interview, January 28, 1974. That contention conflicts with Henley's note of December 5, 1968, which indicates that part of the $150,000 in checks Mayhew received on September 9, 1968, was to cover the Humphrey contribution. Henley Exhibit 4, Note 32 Supra. Humphrey had denied personally receiving a cash contribution from Mayhew. End of footnote. In sum, the evidence reflects that Mayhew did receive $100,000 on December 5 and 6, 1968, from the Sands and from Henley, the disposition of which has never been conclusively determined. Once regarding the Sands money, and once regarding the Henley money. Mayhew stated that the same money was later used for the first delivery of $50,000 to Rebozo. Danner corroborated this possibility by testifying that Mayhew told him the first delivery contained the same money that was undelivered in 1968. Footnote: Hearings 9532. Danner's recollection is not now clear. He stated that he cannot testify with certainty that one of the $50,000 deliveries consisted of exactly the same money as was available in 1968. 24 Hearings 11542. End of footnote. A telephone message taken by one of Mayhew's secretaries on November 22, 1968, showed a call from one Stephen Craig with the Nixon election campaign in New York City. The message reads, quote, "Contribution, have deficit of $800,000." End quote. The Select Committee learned of this note shortly before June 28 and therefore had no time to explore its full significance. Taken at face value, however, it shows a post-election interest of the Nixon campaign in soliciting funds from Hughes. On December 17, 1968, Mayhew received a form letter from President-elect Nixon thanking, quote, "all of those who contributed so generously to our cause." End quote. In early December, Mayhew received $100,000 in cash in 2 days, traveled to Palm Springs, and, Mayhew has stated, tried unsuccessfully to deliver the money to Richard Nixon or an aide of his. In addition, Richard Danner was in Las Vegas from December 5 through 8, 1968, talking with Mayhew and other Hughes aides about possibly joining the Hughes Nevada operations. Danner is not sure whether he was aware of Mayhew's trip to Palm Springs at the time it occurred, and he denied receiving any money from Mayhew or other Hughes agents at that time. Further, Danner testified that this visit to Las Vegas, his only visit to the Hughes operation in 1968, quote, "had nothing to do with the campaign contributions, none whatsoever." End quote. However, on November 29, 1972, Danner told IRS Special Agent Donald Skelton that, quote, "he thought he and Mayhew began discussing the prospective contribution shortly after the 1968 election, which preceded his employment with Hughes Tool Company." End quote. 4. Nadine Henley, June 27 through July 11, 1969. On July 11, 1969, Robert Mayhew acknowledged in writing the receipt of $50,000 cash from Howard Hughes, quote, "for non-deductible contributions." End quote. The phrase used to cover money for political contributions. Nadine Henley acknowledged sending the cash to Mayhew at his request. She did not, however, know why Mayhew requested the money, and apparently did not make a note of the purpose of the transaction, as she had done on the December 5, 1968 withdrawal. Mayhew told the Select Committee investigators that this cash may have been the source of the first contribution to Rebozo. When first asked about the source of the first delivery, Mayhew said that the source was the December 5, 1968 money from Henley, which he said he gave to his son Peter immediately after his return from Palm Springs on December 6 or 7. In a later staff interview, Mayhew stated that, based upon his son's recollection, that he held the money he received from his father only a short time. Footnote: Peter Mayhew interview, November 29, 1973. End of footnote. The June-July 1969 money was the source of the delivery. Mayhew was not able to place the July 1969 date in relation to any other events, as he had done for the December 1968 money he received from Henley. He assumed it was the date only because he rejected the December 1968 date. There is no independent evidence corroborating the date. When questioned about the July 11 money by the IRS in March 1973, Mayhew, through his lawyer, professed complete ignorance of the transaction. Nevertheless, less than 1 year later he said it was the source of a delivery to Rebozo. Further, when he told the Select Committee investigators that the July 11 money was the source of the first delivery after discounting the December 5 money from Henley, the investigators were not yet aware of the Sands withdrawal, and Mayhew did not mention it. As the discussion on the Sands withdrawal showed, it is a likely source for the first delivery. 5. Silver Slipper Casino, October 26, 1970. On October 26, 1970, Thomas Bell, a Hughes lawyer in Las Vegas, withdrew $115,000 from the Silver Slipper Casino in Las Vegas. Footnote: See withdrawal slip at 26 hearings, Exhibit 26. Bell related his version of the withdrawal in an interview on December 17, 1973. A fuller explanation of Bell's story is set forth at page 953. End of footnote. According to Bell, he immediately gave $50,000 of that sum to Richard Danner in Danner's office with no one else present. Bell's withdrawal and delivery to Danner were made at Robert Maheu's request, according both to Bell and Maheu. This was the only time, Bell said, that he was asked to deliver money to Danner. Bell assumed, but was not told by Maheu or Danner, that the money was for a political contribution. Bell had no idea what Danner did with the money. In his latest testimony, Danner denied ever receiving any money from Bell, although he earlier testified that it was possible that Bell delivered money to him. Danner and Maheu were in Key Biscayne shortly after the $50,000 was allegedly given to Danner. This money could be the source only of the second delivery. All other potential delivery dates were before October 26, 1970. 6. A note on storage of the money before delivery to Rebozo. As the earlier section on the rolls of key participants shows, there is some question about where the money for at least one of the deliveries, most likely the first, was held and for how long, between the time it was put together and the time it was delivered to Rebozo. Before the Select Committee, Danner testified as follows. My recollection is that one, perhaps the first one, had been locked in a box in the Frontier cage, and it was obtained from that source. Whether I got it, or Mr. Maheu got it, or one of the secretaries got it, I don't recall. The second contribution, again, I don't recall whether it was Robert Maheu or his son Peter Maheu who delivered it to me, either in their office or my office, but I am reasonably certain that this is the way the two deliveries were made to me. In his November 29, 1972 telephone conversation with IRS Special Agent Skelton, according to the IRS memorandum, Danner told Skelton that the first delivery was in Key Biscayne in September 1969, and that the money that was delivered had been kept intact in the Frontier cage, quote, for at least 6 months, end quote. Footnote. Ibid. Danner told the Select Committee that Maheu told him the undelivered money from 1968 was in a safe deposit box at the Frontier, and that he, Danner, was, quote, fairly certain, end quote, that it was the 1968 money. 20 hearings, 9532. End of footnote. Which would mean at least since March 1969. The spring of 1969 was about the same time, according to Danner, that Rebozo was chiding him about Hughes' failure to support President Nixon. Danner was apparently personally involved in storing the money. He told Skelton that he, Danner, had personally supervised the transfer of the money while it was in the cage from a manila envelope to a locked box. The only sources for money that was intact as early as March 1969 were A. The Sands in early December 1968, or B. Nadine Henley on December 5, 1968. Thus, Danner's story to Skelton tends to support the view that the money for the first delivery was the same money that had been obtained in December 1968. End of Section 11. Recording by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida.
Section 12 of the Watergate Report, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Final Report of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, Volume 3. Chapter 8, The Hughes-Rebozo Investigation and Related Matters, Part 5. C. An Analysis of Possible Delivery Dates. 1. December 1968, the Bahamas. On the disbursement form Lawrence Rylick prepared regarding the withdrawal from the sands in early December 1968, Rylick wrote at some later date the following notation. The money was taken by John Ianni and given to Bob Mayhew. I was told he was to give this to President Nixon on Mayhew's trip to the Bahamas. The Select Committee has been unable to corroborate the accuracy of this remark. According to Rylick, he made this handwritten entry regarding the Bahamas as one of his periodic attempts to make a record of the purposes for cash withdrawals given to Mayhew, should he later be questioned by Hughes officials or anyone else regarding his role in obtaining funds for Mayhew. Rylick was not sure who told him the money was intended for then-President-elect Nixon, but he thought it might have been Nigro himself or Jack Hooper, chief of security for the Hughes operation. Nigro is dead, and Hooper has apparently been seriously ill since at least the fall of 1973 and has been unavailable for questioning. There is no evidence that Mayhew was in the Bahamas after the sands withdrawal. Danner originally testified that he visited Rebozo and President-elect Nixon on Robert Abplanalp's Bahamian island, Grand Cay, sometime between the 1968 election and the inauguration in 1969. President-elect Nixon visited that island on November 18-19, 1968, and on December 26, 1968. Danner's diary does not show him in the Bahamas or nearby at either time Mr. Nixon was there in late 1968. He was in Spanish Cay and Freeport in the Bahamas from December 10 through 15, 1968, a visit that Danner testified had nothing to do with political contributions or the delivery of money to President-elect Nixon or Rebozo. Danner's latest testimony, based upon an examination of his 1968 diary, is that 1. He saw President Nixon in the Bahamas only once in 1968, and 2. That visit was on April 11th and 12th, 1968, at Walker's Cay, part of Abplanalp's property. Further, Danner testified that he did not receive any money from Hughes's representatives in December 1968. Danner was in Las Vegas from December 5th through 8th, 1968, which was the same time period as 1. The receipt by Mayhew of $100,000 in cash, 2. The unsuccessful delivery of $50,000 to President-elect Nixon or an aide in Palm Springs, and 3. The shipment to the Las Vegas bank used by the Hughes-owned casinos of 50 consecutively numbered $100 bills that were in the money Rebozo returned and identified as the first delivery. While no firm conclusions can be drawn, this evidence and Rylick's note establish an interesting set of coincidences. 2. April 2nd through 10th, 1969, Key Biscayne. No one has testified to this date as a delivery date. This was Danner's first trip to Miami after he joined the Hughes organization, and according to Danner, it concerned business dealings in the Bahamas. Mayhew told the Select Committee investigators that the first delivery was made in Key Biscayne not long after Danner joined the Hughes operation, but he was unable to pinpoint the date. There is no indication from available travel or hotel records that Mayhew was with Danner in Florida at this time. In summary, this is a possible delivery date without substantial support. 3. June 26, 1969, Key Biscayne. Like the April 2nd through 10th date, there was no testimony supporting this specific date. Danner had no specific recollection of this trip, although he testified that in the spring of 1969, Rebozo was more or less needling him about Hughes's financial support of Hubert Humphrey and Hughes's failure to contribute to President Nixon. Danner testified that around May, possibly early in June 1969, after Rebozo had once refused a $50,000 contribution, Danner and Rebozo began discussing the possibility that Hughes would contribute funds for the 1970 congressional campaign. 4. September 11th and 12th, 1969, Key Biscayne. There is evidence that makes this the most probable delivery date for the first contribution. The factors suggesting this as a delivery date include the following. 1. The Rebozo-Danner discussions about Hughes's failure to contribute had set the stage for a delivery. 2. According to Danner, Mayhew, who was aware of the Danner-Rebozo conversations about contribution, authorized a delivery to Rebozo sometime during the summer, maybe as late as August 1969. 3. By this time, Mayhew had obtained an additional $50,000 in cash from Nadine Henley. 4. When first questioned about the first delivery by the IRS on May 15, 1972, Danner made statements that fit with a number of facts about the September 11th-12th trip. He stated as follows: "Mayhew showed me the envelope. I saw that it contained packets of money. I did not count it. As I recall it, it was in his office at the Frontier Hotel. We took the de Havilland, flew to Miami, went to Key Biscayne, met Rebozo at his house. Mayhew handed him the package and says, 'Here's $50,000, first installment.' Rebozo thanked him. Mayhew told him then that there would be more forthcoming later on, and that wound up the transaction. We therefore went to dinner. We didn't discuss the campaign contributions any further that I recall. The next morning I left and flew back to Las Vegas. My recollection is on that trip Mayhew stayed, kept the plane down there in Miami. He had some other business to look into." While Danner's recollection has changed, his early testimony is worthy of particular scrutiny because A. It is his first recollection, that is, closest in time to the event itself. B. It was given free of consultation with Rebozo. And C. It comports substantially with Mayhew's recollection of the event. A. Mayhew has stated that he was present at a Key Biscayne delivery. Records of the Key Biscayne Hotel show that Danner and Mayhew were there on September 11th and 12th, 1969. Records of the Hughes Company plane show that it made a trip to Miami on September 11th, returning to Las Vegas on September 12th. Danner's records, however, show a $152 expense for travel on September 11th-12th, indicating the possibility that he traveled by commercial airliner on part of his trip to Miami and back. If he traveled by commercial carrier from Miami to Las Vegas on September 12th, that fact would coincide with his statement to the IRS that he returned to Las Vegas alone while Mayhew kept the Hughes plane. On July 5, 1973, Danner signed an affidavit to correct his May 15, 1972 testimony to the IRS. In this affidavit, he stated that the first contribution was made in San Clemente on July 3, 1970. However, in subsequent testimony in court and before the Select Committee, Danner testified that he is certain only that a delivery, not necessarily the first, was made on July 3, 1970. His testimony, therefore, still leaves open the possibility, particularly when considered in light of the facts outlined here, that the first delivery was September 11th and 12th, 1969. B. In his initial IRS testimony quoted above, Danner testified that the delivery was made at Rebozo's house by Danner and Mayhew, and that the three of them thereafter went to dinner. Mayhew's version of the Key Biscayne delivery, at which he said he was present, conforms to Danner's in two respects. Mayhew told the Select Committee that the delivery was made in Rebozo's house, and that the three men then went together to dinner. Both Danner and Rebozo testified before the Select Committee that the delivery was at Rebozo's bank office without Mayhew present, and Danner cannot remember whether he and Rebozo dined together after the delivery was made. Finally, Danner once placed the time of the first delivery as September 1969. On December 29, 1972, after he had first answered questions before the IRS, Danner called IRS Special Agent Donald Skelton in response to IRS requests that Danner review his records regarding possible dates and places of delivery. Danner told Skelton, according to the contemporaneous memorandum Skelton prepared, that A. As near as he, Danner, could tell, the first delivery was made in September 1969. B. The money for the delivery was locked in a secure box in the Frontier Hotel cage for at least 6 months before the delivery. C. At Danner's instructions, the money was once transferred within the cage from one box to another. D. He and Mayhew made the first delivery in Key Biscayne. And E. The second delivery was in San Clemente on July 3, 1970. F. Mayhew and Danner began talking about making a contribution to Rebozo shortly after the 1968 election, before Danner joined Hughes. These facts would tend to establish the dates of the deliveries. In addition, it is worth noting that the information Danner provided on November 29, 1972, comports with his earlier testimony to the IRS and with the evidence summarized in this section, although he testified to the Select Committee that he was reasonably certain that no delivery of money was made on that date. Taken altogether, however, the evidence described above indicates that September 11-12, 1969 was the date of the first delivery. 5. February 3 through 5, 1970, Key Biscayne. On February 3 through 5, 1970, Danner was in Key Biscayne, registered at the Key Biscayne Hotel. According to Danner's expense records, he had contact with Rebozo re TWA suit Air West matters on this trip. According to his testimony, the TWA versus Hughes case and the acquisition of Air West were the subjects of discussions with Rebozo at that time. Although the hotel records subpoenaed by the Select Committee do not show Mayhew in Key Biscayne on February 3 through 5, Danner testified that Mayhew was with him on this trip, which included a visit to Nassau by Danner, Rebozo, and perhaps Mayhew. Robert Weir, a pilot of Hughes's private plane, the de Havilland, testified that Mayhew might have been on the flight with Danner from Las Vegas to Miami, and that Mayhew was definitely on the plane when it left Miami and returned to Las Vegas via Washington, D.C. Mayhew told the Select Committee that he was on the flight to Miami with Danner, and that he and Danner met with Rebozo on February 3 through 5, 1970. In addition, Mayhew told the investigators that he testified before a Las Vegas federal grand jury investigating Hughes's acquisition of Air West that the second delivery to Rebozo was made in a meeting among Mayhew, Danner, and Rebozo on February 3 through 5, 1970. Mayhew, however, could not explain the basis of that testimony. Rebozo may have been in Las Vegas shortly before the flight to Miami and may have flown with Danner and Mayhew from Las Vegas to Miami. When confronted with that possibility, Mayhew stated that it was unlikely that he and Danner would have gone with Rebozo to Florida to make a delivery if Rebozo were already in Las Vegas. Aside from Mayhew's testimony before a grand jury, the evidence that February 3 through 5, 1970 was a delivery date, assuming only 2 deliveries, is not as strong as the evidence on other dates, such as September 11-12, 1969. 6. March 20th through 22nd, 1970, Key Biscayne. Danner and Mayhew were in Key Biscayne on the above dates, immediately after Danner received approval from Attorney General John Mitchell for Hughes's proposal to buy the Dunes Hotel. All parties have denied that a delivery was made on this date. Mayhew stated that he made a trip to Key Biscayne to see Rebozo sometime during March 1970, and that the purpose was to discuss AEC testing, not to deliver money to Rebozo. Rebozo, of course, placed the first delivery on July 3rd, some 4 months later. Danner supported Mayhew's recollection that the discussions with Rebozo were about AEC testing and that no contribution was made on that date. In sum, there is no firm evidence that this was the date of a delivery, although all participants would have a substantial interest in not admitting to a delivery date so close to the Dunes decision by John Mitchell. 7. July 3, 1970, San Clemente. This is the only date upon which Danner and Rebozo agree that one of the contributions was made. When questioned initially by the IRS, Rebozo said that one delivery was at San Clemente and one at Key Biscayne, but that he could not remember which one came first. In later testimony before the Select Committee, Rebozo stated that the first delivery was at San Clemente on July 3, 1970. Danner also placed the first delivery on this date in his IRS affidavit of July 5, 1973, which changed his May 1972 IRS testimony that San Clemente was the second delivery. In later testimony, however, he testified only that a delivery, not necessarily the first, was in San Clemente. Robert Mayhew told the Select Committee that his understanding was that both deliveries were made in Key Biscayne. Both Danner and Rebozo testified in detail about the July 3rd delivery, which included, according to Danner, a visit with President Nixon immediately after the delivery. 8. August 19th and 20th, 1970, Key Biscayne. This is also a likely delivery date. Based at least partly upon his travel records, which show him in Key Biscayne August 19th and 20th, 1970, Danner testified before the Select Committee that a delivery could have been made at this time. In addition, in his July 5, 1973 affidavit for the IRS, he stated that he was certain that the second delivery was on August 19th and 20th, 1970. Danner originally thought the Key Biscayne delivery was in August 1969, but his travel records show no trip to Key Biscayne in that period. Danner remembered a time lapse, the extent of which I am unable to define more accurately, between the first delivery and the second delivery. If the first delivery were on July 3rd, the second delivery would have been either August 19th, 20th or October 28th through 30th, a date discussed below. Danner discounted the October date as too close to the 1970 election for the money to have been used for congressional campaigns, and Mayhew questioned the October date for the same reason. Rebozo testified that the second delivery was in Key Biscayne, following the July 3, 1970 delivery within a matter of weeks. It could have been 3 months. I don't know. I think I saw somewhere Danner had indicated it was in August, and that would be correct. August 19th or 20th was within a matter of weeks of July 3, 1970, while October 28th through 30th is almost 4 months after July 3rd. Rebozo's recollection of a matter of weeks between deliveries, plus his inclination to accept the August date, lend credence to August 19th or 20th, 1970 as a delivery date. Danner's present recollection is that he made the trip to Key Biscayne alone, that Mayhew was neither present at the delivery nor in the Key Biscayne area when it was made. There is no indication that Mayhew was in Key Biscayne on August 19th or 20th, in contrast to September 11th to 12th, 1969, February 3rd to 5th, 1970, March 20th to 22nd, 1970, and, see below, October 28th to 30th, 1970. If Danner is correct about Mayhew not being on the trip to Key Biscayne at which a delivery to Rebozo was made, then August 19th to 20th would be the date for a delivery. 9. October 28th to 30th, 1970, Key Biscayne. There is substantial conflict in the testimony with regard to these possible dates. Robert Mayhew has stated that he instructed Thomas Bell sometime in 1970 to withdraw $50,000 from the Silver Slipper Casino in Las Vegas and deliver it to Danner. Bell, as noted earlier, told Select Committee investigators that at Robert Mayhew's direction he withdrew $115,000 from the Silver Slipper Casino in Las Vegas on October 26, 1970, and delivered $50,000 of that sum to Danner on the same day. Danner's expense records show him in Key Biscayne for conference with Rebozo as part of a trip to Washington, D.C. and Miami on October 26 to 30th, 1970, and hotel records show Danner and Mayhew in Key Biscayne on October 28 to 29th, 1970. President Nixon was also in Key Biscayne on October 27th to 28th. There is no evidence that he met with Danner or Mayhew or was aware of a contribution made in Key Biscayne. Danner could not recall whether the president was in Key Biscayne when the delivery there was made. The strongest evidence supporting this late 1970 date is Thomas Bell's statement, based upon the withdrawal slip from the Silver Slipper, that he gave $50,000 to Danner on October 26th. On the other hand, Danner's testimony that he did not receive money from Bell, plus the statements of Danner and Robert Mayhew that a delivery was probably not made so close to the 1970 congressional elections, cast doubt upon this date. D. Storage of the money by Rebozo. Richard Danner testified that he delivered the cash to Bebe Rebozo in manila envelopes and that the cash was wrapped with bank wrappers from the Valley Bank of Nevada. Rebozo testified that he received the first $50,000 in a letter-sized thick manila envelope, which he then took without opening it and marked HH in the corner. In addition, Rebozo recalled that he wrote instructions on the envelope addressed to Thomas H. Wakefield, General Counsel, telling him that if anything should happen to Rebozo, Wakefield should turn the funds over to the finance chairman of the 1972 campaign. Rebozo then took the envelope and put it in safe deposit box number 224 in the Key Biscayne Bank and Trust Company. Records from the Key Biscayne Bank and Trust indicate that safe deposit box number 224 was rented on July 9, 1968, by C.G. Rebozo, with Thomas H. Wakefield as the lessee deputy. Rebozo testified that he subsequently prepared a letter of instructions to Thomas Wakefield concerning what to do with the money in box number 224, which Rebozo placed in the director's safe deposit box at the Key Biscayne Bank. Rebozo testified that he prepared the letter that was in the director's box a few weeks or possibly a month after he had placed the first envelope in safe deposit box 224. Thomas Wakefield declined to testify as to whether Rebozo gave him any instructions regarding the safe deposit box, because he claimed the information was privileged under the attorney-client relationship with Rebozo. However, Wakefield stated in an interview on October 18, 1973, that sometime in 1968 or 1969, Rebozo gave him a key to the box and explained that in case of Rebozo's death, Wakefield should open the box and follow the instructions. Rebozo testified that the second contribution was also in a manila envelope that he placed in safe deposit box 224, and that he placed rubber bands around the two envelopes. Rebozo testified that he told Rosemary Woods about the first Hughes contribution, either at the time of delivery at San Clemente or immediately thereafter. Rebozo also testified that he probably informed Woods of the second contribution at the White House. Rebozo added that he may have spoken to Woods about the Hughes contributions 3 or 4 times. In a letter dated October 18, 1973, to Special Agent John Bartlett of the IRS, Woods recalled, "Mr. Rebozo told me that he had put this campaign contribution in a safety deposit box, and further that he had given his attorney instructions in the event of his death that he should open the box and follow the instructions therein. It was my understanding that those instructions were to deliver the contents to the campaign chairman or finance chairman of the next campaign." In addition, Woods gave testimony concerning Rebozo's conversation with her about the contribution as follows. Mr. Lenzner: "And do you know how soon after he received the money he told you he received it?" Miss Woods: "No, sir." Mr. Lenzner: "In other words—" Miss Woods: "I'm sorry, I do not." Mr. Lenzner: "I'm sorry, finish your answer, go ahead." Miss Woods: "I do not recall because I don't recall when he told me. I don't recall when he got the money, so I do not know how soon after." Woods also testified that when Rebozo advised her of the contribution, he did not specify the campaign for which the contribution was designated. Rebozo testified that at some point after he received the contributions, he thought he should take a look at the money itself. He testified that the money had Las Vegas wrappers on it, which he removed and replaced with rubber bands because of the stigma that is applied to anything from Las Vegas. Herbert Kalmbach testified that he met Bebe Rebozo on January 8, 1974, and that Rebozo told him words to the effect that, "Undoubtedly, Herb, I've not told you that after you and I talked last spring regarding the Hughes money, April 30, 1973, I found that I had not in fact disbursed any of the Hughes cash to the several people I named. When I went into the safe deposit box, I found that the wrappers around that cash had not been disturbed, and so it was clear that no part of this money had been used during the several years it was in my box." Emphasis added. Since Rebozo's discussion with Kalmbach was on April 30, 1973, then either his statement that he removed the bank wrappers and placed rubber bands around the money is not true, or his statement to Kalmbach was not true. In this regard, it is significant to note the comments of Kenneth Whitaker, the FBI agent who was present on June 18, 1973, at Rebozo's request, when Rebozo opened the safe deposit box and had a list of the serial numbers made. According to Whitaker, there were 10 to 12 packets of money in 2 envelopes. Some of the packets were held together by rubber bands, as Rebozo has testified, but Whitaker said some of the packages were still in bank wrappers. Thus, according to Whitaker, at least some of the money in Rebozo's possession was still wrapped in bank wrappers shortly before its return. Rebozo testified that he again entered the safe deposit box to destroy the original envelopes in which the money was contained after the signals changed. Rebozo said that the signals changed when he decided not to contribute the cash to the campaign sometime after the Hughes-Mayhew split in 1970 and before the campaign. Although Rebozo has testified that the money was for the 1972 Nixon campaign, FBI agent Whitaker told his FBI superiors that on June 18, 1973, Rebozo told him that the contribution had been for the 1970 congressional campaigns. Danner testified that it was for 1970. The Hughes-Mayhew split was not until December 1970, 1 month after the 1970 congressional election. Therefore, if the money were for that election, the Hughes-Mayhew split offers no reason for Rebozo not contributing the cash to the appropriate campaign committees in 1970. Rebozo recalled that after the signals changed, he took the safe deposit box into his office and placed the packets of money in large brown envelopes, that replaced the envelopes with instructions on them. Rebozo thought this occasion, when he destroyed the envelopes with the instructions to Wakefield on them, was probably in 1972. Rebozo testified that his sole purpose for changing envelopes was to eliminate the instructions on the original envelopes. He could not recall if he placed any markings on the envelopes to keep the two contributions separate. The occasions when Rebozo entered his safe deposit box are difficult to determine from his records, since his visitation record card from Safe Deposit Box 224 shows 5 visits between December 26, 1969 and June 5, 1970, but no visits between June 5, 1970 and June 18, 1973, when the money was removed from the safe deposit box to be counted. Rebozo testified that there was no record of his entry into the safe deposit box because he got the key himself without signing the access card required for other customers. At some time, Rebozo destroyed the original envelopes containing the instructions to Wakefield. He destroyed the letter to Wakefield in the director's box at some later time. Rebozo testified that he once lost all of his keys to his safe deposit boxes. In July 1973, Rebozo informed the IRS that he had lost his keys approximately a year before he talked to them. Rebozo testified that his bank uses interchangeable locks on the boxes, so he switched the locks for the boxes with the lost keys. Rebozo testified that he then requested Wakefield's key so that he could get into the safe deposit box. After the lock was changed, Rebozo testified that he then gave Wakefield another key that was a replacement. Wakefield testified that after he first received a safe deposit key from Rebozo, he placed it in an envelope in his safe where it remained until June 18, 1973. According to Wakefield, 1. He received the key sometime in 1968 or 1969. 2. Rebozo never asked him for the key. 3. Rebozo never gave him another safe deposit key. And 4. Rebozo never told him he had changed the lock on box 224. Rebozo could recall nothing else that was done to the money or to safe deposit box 224 until he returned the money in 1973. End of section 12. Recording by Maria Casper.